How does the Israel-Hamas conflict affect Brazil? That's what we're talking about on this week's edition of Brazil This Week. Hello and welcome to another edition of Brazil This Week, brought to you by the Brazilian Report. My name is Euan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and I'm joined today by our Brasilia correspondent, Cedê Silva. Cedê, how are you doing?
I'm great, Euan. Thank you for having me.
And so the topic this week, as I mentioned at the beginning there, is, it's the topic that's on everyone's lips around the world, I would hazard a guess. It's the renewed conflict between Israel and Hamas, which has broken out in the last week. But today we are focusing because, obviously this is this is Brazil This Week, brought to you by the Brazilian Report. So we're kind of, taking it from the Brazilian side of things and how this affects Brazil, if it affects Brazil, and what are the discussions going on here in relation to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Because there's plenty of coverage all around the world on the ground and of the proper, the humanitarian ramifications of the conflict. But here we're talking about Brazil's involvement in it and Brazil's reaction to it. So let's begin with that, Cedê. When we had Hamas launching their invasion of Israeli territory, what is the first Brazilian reaction, the official reaction from the federal government?
Okay, so President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, he's currently recovering at home from a hospital procedure, from a pre-planned surgery. And so Lula is not appearing in public, but Lula has been expressing through social media statements. So on Saturday, which was the day that Hamas militants stormed Israel and the music festival, Lula condemned what he called a terrorist attack, but he did not name Hamas by name. And the fact that Lula chose not to name Hamas became sort of a spring or a beginning or a trigger for a whole lot of political repercussions, because then you have lots of people on the right-wing opposition, notably former or acting evangelical preachers, calling for the Brazilian government to expressly condemn Hamas and to say that Hamas is a terrorist group. And so this was the beginning of a battle that is still ongoing, and we can address it specifically in a lot of questions.
And yeah, so I think maybe the first thing we should address beyond the official reaction from the federal government is, do we have Brazilians involved in the conflict? Are the Brazilians in the Gaza Strip? Are Brazilians in Israel? What is happening to them? What has happened to them? What will happen to them?
Okay, so the Brazilian government has confirmed that 2 Brazilians were killed by Hamas militants in the music festival. The Brazilian government, we need to say this very clearly because there are always people carefully watching. The Brazilian government has not blamed Hamas specifically for the killings, but we know that both of these Brazilians, a man aged 23 and a woman aged 24, they were both killed in the music festival that was stormed by Hamas militants. So the Brazilian government has confirmed the deaths of 2 Brazilian civilians in the Hamas-Israel war. A spokesman for the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, previously claimed that there were also Brazilian citizens among those kept hostage by Hamas, but the Brazil's Foreign Affairs Ministry has not confirmed this. And later, the same Israeli spokesman, he retracted his statements. And nowadays, they say they're not sure if there are Brazilians being held captive by Hamas. So this is the confirmed situation of what we can say about people killed and people supposedly being held hostage by Hamas operatives. Separately, we do have the issue of Brazilian tourists and residents in Israel and in the Gaza Strip, who the government has tried to rescue from Brazil. And I believe that our producer, Deco, has some images of that. We have a Brazilian plane a Brazilian military plane, Deco. Deco is probably searching the image right now. So what Brazil's government has done is, okay, so this is the foreign diplomats. We have images of the plane going next. So this image is of the second Brazilian military plane, which rescued over 200 people from Israel. And this is another image of the aircraft. This is the first aircraft we know because with the back, we see his white hair. There's Brazil's defense minister, José Múcio Monteiro, when he was receiving the first military plane, also with a little over 200 people that came back from Israel. Brazil's armed forces are organizing an ongoing rescue operation to rescue Brazilians who are in Israel. It has given priority to Brazilian tourists who do not reside in Israel, but it has said that any Brazilian that wants to leave Israel will be able to do so on this plane. So the way that it is working is Brazil is sending its planes first to Rome in Italy, and later, when authorized by Israel, these planes will land in Israel and they will get the Brazilians. And as you can see by the flags here, many of these Brazilians that were recently rescued are evangelical churchgoers that attend these missions by their churches to go to the Holy Land, to visit the holy sites and so on. So there are lots of evangelical Brazilians. And to begin our debate about how this war is being debated in Brazil, a lot of left-wing observers have drawn attention to the fact that when these evangelical Brazilians are interviewed during the rescue operations, they thank Brazil's armed forces and they thank Brazil's Air Force, but they do not thank the Lula administration, which is also one of the aspects of how this political divide between right and left and between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine is being played out in Brazil is also in what you do not say. So, for example, you have people being rescued and do not thank the administration, but expressly thank the armed forces as a way to show support for the armed forces, but not for the left-wing Lula administration.
Yeah, no, Cedê, I mean, that is definitely going to be, I think maybe the meat of this discussion, especially like the second part of the discussion, is how, the Brazilian, some people would say kind of culture wars have taken this, the kind of Israel-Palestine issue. But just before we jump onto that, I mean, we've mentioned about rescuing Brazilian tourists and Brazilian residents in Israel, but what have we heard of Brazilians in the Gaza Strip in Palestine? Because that's obviously a very different matter. You can't just fly out of the Gaza Strip.
Correctly. So Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira has said yesterday that he recently talked with his Egyptian counterpart, so the Egyptian foreign minister, and they are trying to coordinate authorization for a bus of about 30 Brazilians and their relatives to leave the Gaza Strip through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. But that has not happened yet because the border is intermittently closed, so it will close and open in different times because of security issues. But they are coordinating with Egypt in trying to get the Brazilians out. The picture you see here is a press conference held yesterday on Wednesday with Brazilian diplomats, and it is one of the spaces where the Brazilian government expressed also how it is coordinating to evacuate also Brazilians from the Gaza Strip, in addition to Brazilians in Israel.
And it's just quite fascinating because a lot of the coverage we've had on the Brazilian report recently, and some of your own coverage today, has pointed out the fact that this month Brazil has the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council. So, what a month to have the rotational presidency come to Brazil, because in certain aspects, a lot of eyes are going to be on Brazil. So how have they kind of dealt with that so far?
Yeah, it was going to be a busy month regardless. On the first day of Brazil presiding the Security Council for the month of October, the Council approved a resolution about Haiti and authorizing a police mission in Haiti, which will not have UN troops, but will have troops from Kenya and other countries authorized or endorsed by the United Nations. And also discussions on Ukraine would also be inevitable per the Brazilian diplomats themselves. And what Brazil is trying to do is whenever there are discussions or press questions about this Israel-Hamas war, Brazilian authorities will remind their listeners that Brazil is presiding the Security Council for the month of October and that these discussions are taking place in the United Nations Security Council. For example, in the issue of Hamas, so initially, as I said, on Saturday, Lula condemned the terrorist attacks, and he called them terrorist attacks, but he did not call Hamas by name. And Brazilian authorities are now being questioned on why Brazil does not designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, and why does not Brazil classify Hamas as a terrorist organization. And the diplomats, as in the press conference we just showed, they replied that this kind of things are discussed in the United Nations Security Council. And this Thursday, the Foreign Ministry released a statement further endorsing this view that Brazil will follow on the classification of terrorist organizations. Brazil follows what the United Nations Security Council does. And the way it works is that the United Nations Security Council does not actually have a list of designated terrorist organizations as the United States, UK, and NATO, for instance, maintain. But what the United Nations does is they will have a list of terrorist organizations that are under sanctions. So the UN will not classify an organization as terrorist without sanctions. They will only classify you as terrorist if there are sanctions imposed against that entity or against that person. And Hamas, obviously, is not on that list due to permanent members of the Security Council, such as Russia and China, and some other rotational members of the Security Council who have sympathies towards Hamas or the Palestinian cause do not endorse such classification.
Okay, excellent, Cedê. So before we get into the kind of the meat of the discussion at home in Brazil, I'd just like to remind our viewers that this, Brazil This Week is a video series that is powered by the Brazilian Report. So it's an independent media outlet covering Brazil and Latin America. And we are subscription-based, so we require your support. We need your support to keep ourselves going and keep ourselves independent, to continue doing this coverage of Brazil and the wider continent. And as you can see, there's the website there. We have also our subscription page where you can check out all our different subscription offers. All of them start with as $1 for the first month, but there are 3 different tiers there. Have a wee look. You'll be able to find something that will definitely fit your budget and fit your desires, fit your needs. So yeah, definitely check out Brazilian.report/subscribe. And if you're already a subscriber and you want to kind of help us out a little bit more, or if you're not ready to subscribe just now, but would like to throw a bit of help our way, do check out our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, which is where you can donate us a couple of cups of coffee every now and again to keep our journalists fueled and covering Brazil and Latin America. Cedê, obviously, is one of our journalists, requires his caffeine to keep him fueled, and he's enjoying your help from buying a coffee. That's fueling Cedê's coffee mug there. And also, if you want to join, if you want to give us a recurring donation on Buy Me a Coffee, you can join our Buy Me a Coffee subscription, which will give you access to a lot of kind of free behind-the-scenes newsletters and other insider content that we prepare for you there. And yeah, definitely check out buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. The link is below on your screen, and we also have a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner. So let's get back to this discussion then on the Israel-Hamas conflict. As we promised, the meat of this discussion is going to be how these subjects and how, in general, the Israel-Palestine issues are treated in Brazil by politicians and by certain different groups. You mentioned, Cedê, that a lot of the people coming back from Israel were kind of showing themselves to be declared kind of outwardly evangelical Christian. So what kind of help our viewers understand what is the link there between a kind of a evangelical Christian group generally in Brazil quite to the right of center and the Jewish state of Israel?
Yeah, so polls in Brazil consistently show that a large majority of evangelical Brazilians are Bolsonaro voters. So they voted for to re-elect former far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. And some of these evangelicals, just as much as in the United States, are big supporters of Israel. And some of them in the US, for example, they will sponsor settlements in the West Bank, or they will sponsor Israeli settlements in some degree. And some of those evangelicals, they believe that by supporting Israel and that by supporting settlements in West Jordan, in the West Bank, they will somehow accelerate the final judgment days. They will accelerate the apocalypse, and they will accelerate the return of Jesus. And so this is an important theological issue for part of the evangelicals, both in Brazil and in the United States. And some of them might not believe that they can accelerate the final judgment, but regardless, they have strong sympathies for the Israeli cause. And some of them on social media, for instance, they will bear Israeli flags and support for the Israeli cause, and so on. So they believe they are they form part of the so-called Judeo-Christian alliance, and so they have a sympathy towards the Israeli side of the conflict. On the other hand, there are a lot of people in the traditional left wing and members of the Workers' Party in Brazil, some of them lawmakers, who have a strong sympathies towards the Palestinian side, which does include on part of them support for Hamas, or at least not explicitly condemning Hamas or opposing the classification of Hamas as a terrorist group, because they say, quote unquote, that resistance is not terrorism. So you have people on both sides of the political aisle in Brazil who are willing to join sides and take sides, as opposed to forming a more nuanced or more balanced view of the conflict. Some of them on both sides are more than willing to very strongly take sides on the issue.
Yeah, and so just tell us then, Cedê, just how this kind of the dichotomy of the right and left in Brazil towards the Israel-Palestine issue, tell us how that has kind of manifested itself in Congress, for example. I mean, you mentioned a lot of lawmakers do take sides, so...
Yeah, so this new episode of the conflict, the largest Hamas attack ever, took place on Saturday. So the first reaction we saw from Congress itself was on Sunday night. Deco has the image of the Senate summit. So there you have it. To the left of the photograph, you see the Senate. And to the right, you see the House, which has remained blank. So on the left, you see their lighting that reflects the Israeli flag over the Senate, but the House remained blank. The Senate said that it is displayed the Israeli flag at the request of Senator Davi Alcolumbre. Senator Davi Alcolumbre, who used to be Senate president and is now is still an influential senator. He heads the Constitution and Justice Committee, which is the most important committee in the Senate. He is Jewish, and he was the one to request the display of the Israeli flag in solidarity to the Israelis on Sunday night. So this took place on Sunday night before Congress is actually open for actual debates. But then, when senators are back in Brasilia from Monday on, they started pressuring the Brazilian federal government in condemning Hamas explicitly, which was not done before, and in classifying Hamas as a terrorist organization. So on the next photo, I believe Deco is going to show, okay, so let's get to the House first. So the House, both the House and the Senate had discussions about the conflict, and a lot of right-wing lawmakers in the House, especially right-wing pastors, they altered motions to condemn Hamas. And there are also some motions mourning or expressing grief for the deaths of the two Brazilian confirmed kills in the music festival on Saturday. But left-wing House lawmakers, they penned a motion too, which condemns violence on both sides. And the way that the House Speaker handled this is he joined all the motions in a single vote, And so they were all unanimously approved. But there are some people on the right wing that were dissatisfied with this decision because they wanted to condemn exclusively Hamas violence, but not violence on part of the Israeli military. So this debate is also taking place in Brazil and in Brazil House. There's also the issue that some of the House lawmakers who are still in the House and some of them who have left the House and have joined the Lula administration and the Lula cabinet, back in 2021, they signed a manifesto that supported Hamas because it was rejecting the classification by the British government of Hamas as a terrorist organization in late 2021. One of the undersigners of this manifesto, Father João, a former Catholic priest, he doubled down on this manifesto, and he said that even though he repudiates violence against civilians, that he still understands that Israel performs illegal occupation and what he calls an apartheid because of different rights for Israelis and Palestinians. And so he still doubles down on the manifesto. And back on the Senate, then now Deco is going to show us there's Senator Magno Malta. Senator Magno Malta is also an evangelical preacher. He displayed both the Brazilian and Israeli flags in solidarity. And Senator Magno Malta was one of the people that expressed a lot of concern about the Brazilian evangelical churchgoers in Israel, because churches like the one that Magno Malta goes to and other evangelical churches, they will do frequently these trips to Israel with the evangelical churchgoers. And there was a large delegation there at the time. And so he expressed concern there. And then you have Senator Jorge Seifi, who Deco has on the other picture. Senator Jorge Seifi worked under the Jair Bolsonaro administration. He was the National Fishing Secretary, and he was very famous in Brazil because he once claimed that fish are smart and can dodge oil in the water, in the sea. So people should not be concerned about oil leaks because the fish are smart and they can dodge the oil. Anyway, this expert on fishing, Jorge Seifi, is now a senator from the state of Santa Catarina, which is the most right-wing state in Brazil. And Jorge Seifi was very sarcastic in his remarks. You can see he is with the Israeli flag there. And Jorge Seifi dared the Brazilian government and the Brazilian military to go to Israel and to arrest the Hamas terrorists the same way as they did with the January 8 terrorists, because some people, including the Supreme Court, they called the January 8 Bolsonaro supporters who invaded Congress and invaded the presidential palace and the Supreme Court on January 8, called them terrorists. And so Jorge Seifi, well, the Hamas terrorists, they are terrorists too, so why don't you go and arrest them and be equally brave with them? So this is another episode of how Brazilian officials and authorities, they are using the conflict in Israel and comparing it to the Brazilian reality as a way to jab and to score political points in the political battles in Brazil. So they're reflecting the Israel-Hamas conflict back into the Brazilian reality and using that to score points in their own political battles in Brazil.
No, yeah, excellent. And just to finish off here, I mean, there was another example of this kind of political point scoring potentially, and an example of potentially this Israel-Hamas conflict affecting the mayoral election in the country's biggest city next year, Sao Paulo. We had the front runner, Guilherme Boulos, who got into a little bit of trouble with his statements. Could you give us a little bit of insight on that?
Yeah, so on the story I wrote that is going to be published soon on the Brazilian Report, I wrote that this was the first political casualty of the new episode in the Israel-Hamas conflict in Brazil. So there's a left-wing congressman named Guilherme Boulos. He was the best voted congressman in the state of São Paulo last year. And he was very well voted, especially on the capital, São Paulo. And he is the front runner for the mayoral election next year against incumbent mayor Ricardo Nunes. And very recently, on the Friday before the attack, Guilherme Boulos gained a very important political asset, a very important political ally, a new ally, Jean Gorenstein. So Jean Gorenstein served as the health secretary in the state of São Paulo during the previous João Dória administration. He became nationally famous because he participated frequently in the weekly press conference about the COVID emergency. And together with Governor João Dória, Jean Gorenstein became a very strong proponent of vaccines and a very staunch defender of the vaccines, which was very important during the denialist administration of Jair Bolsonaro, because President Bolsonaro was quote-unquote skeptical of the vaccine, and he made actually a political campaign against the vaccine, despite his administration delayedly buying the vaccines. He made a campaign against. And so Jean Gorenstein became a pro-vaccine, pro-mask, pro-quarantine political figure. And since João Dória was a center-right governor, the support of Jean Gorenstein to Guilherme Boulos was seen as important political asset because Boulos belongs to a socialist party, he's left-wing, he's from the homeless movement, and so a lot of people, especially in the state of São Paulo, might consider that Boulos is a far-left radical, and they will be skeptical of voting on him. So on Friday before the conflict, Jean Gorenstein endorses officially Guilherme Boulos, and he says he's on the campaign and is going to contribute to Boulos' health plan and healthcare plan for when Boulos takes over as mayor, if elected next year. Okay, then on Saturday you have the conflict, and people start questioning everyone, all Brazilian officials, on what is their stance. Boulos releases a stance, and he says that he condemns the violence, but once again, as many people in the Brazilian left, he does not cite Hamas by name. He does not even say the name Hamas. So Gorenstein, on the very next day, on Sunday, he says, I'm out. I cannot endorse. I am a Jewish man. I support the state of Israel. And so I cannot stand by this campaign. If he cannot say Hamas by name, he cannot call a spade. So I am out. And after all this backlash, all this tremendous pressure, finally on Tuesday, on a speech on the House floor, Congressman Boulos finally cited Hamas. And he says, I condemn Hamas. But now it was too late. He has already lost Gorenstein for his campaign.
Yeah, so as we see, we're a very long way away from the physical conflict that's happening, but there are these kind of strange and potentially kind of incongruous ramifications in Brazil, and I'm sure that over the next coming weeks and months, we will be covering the continuation of these ramifications here on the Brazilian Report. So, Cedê, thanks a lot for joining us today, and that's our Brasilia correspondent, Cedê Silva of the Brazilian Report.
Thank you, Euan. If I'd just like to add something, in Brazil is a country of immigrants. We have lots of people of both Jewish and Arabic ancestry in Brazil, and sometimes, or a lot of times, they will be on the same side. For example, Finance Minister Fernando Haddad and Planning Minister Simone Tebet are of Lebanese ancestry, and Senator Jacques Wagner, who is Lula's chief whip in Congress, is Jewish. So in Brazil, supposedly, you could have people that are on different sides elsewhere or abroad, but they could be on the same side here. But owing also to political action, sometimes people in Brazil will happily take one of the sides in the conflict, even though in Brazil we could have, and we do have also, different ways of organizing politics in Brazil. So in Brazil, we have it on all different ways. You can have people either on the same side, despite, quote unquote, their ancestry, but you also have people willing to join sides on a conflict that is several thousand kilometers away.
Yeah, well said, Cedê. Well said. And so, yeah, that wraps up this week's edition of Brazil This Week. Just want to remind before we go, you should check out Brazilian.report/subscribe to check out the Brazilian Report, which is the independent media outlet that powers the Brazil This Week videos and also our Explaining Brazil podcast. And we're subscriber-only website, so we need your support to help us keep going and remain independent. in our coverage of Brazil and Latin America. So please do check out Brazilian.report/subscribe. Check out our subscription plans, see what ones fit your budget. And also, if you'd like to give us a little bit more help, check out our Buy Me a Coffee page at buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, where you can send us some donations in the form of cups of coffee for our work, our coverage on Brazil and Latin America. And also you can provide us with a regular donation, which will give you access to a bunch of extra goodies, like behind the scenes newsletters and also other kind of insider content. So please do check that out, buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. Thanks again, Cedê Silva, our Brasilia correspondent. And my name is Euan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and we will speak to you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.